At 72, the world still introduces Oprah Winfrey as a living monument to resilience. Billionaire, media titan, cultural architect, a woman who transformed personal trauma into a global brand built on healing and empowerment. For decades, she has stood as proof that pain can be converted into purpose, that poverty can be transcended, that silence can be broken and turned into influence. But what rarely gets examined is the psychological cost of carrying not only your own history, but the emotional weight of millions who see you as their lighthouse. Her childhood has been publicly documented. Instability, abuse, humiliation, a teenage pregnancy that ended in loss. These experiences were not minor setbacks. They were formative trauma events. Clinical research is clear. Early chronic stress reshapes neurological pathways, especially those regulating fear, attachment, and self-worth. Success does not erase that architecture. Wealth does not rewrite the nervous system. Achievement can mask pain, but it cannot delete imprint. At 72, the question is not whether she overcame adversity. The question is what adversity permanently altered. For 25 years, the Oprah Winfrey Show operated as more than daytime television. It functioned as a national emotional confessional. Survivors of abuse, addiction, betrayal, and grief sat across from her. They cried, they revealed, they broke open, and she held space for all of it. In psychology, secondary trauma is a well-documented phenomenon among therapists and crisis workers. Prolonged exposure to others' suffering creates cumulative emotional strain. Now multiply that by decades. Multiply that by cameras. Multiply that by an audience of millions expecting catharsis by the end of each episode. The world saw inspiration. What it did not see was the invisible accumulation. Then there is the paradox of power. Oprah is not simply wealthy. She is institutionally influential. Her endorsements create bestsellers overnight. Her opinions shape public discourse. Influence at that magnitude restructures human relationships. Trust becomes complicated. Authenticity becomes difficult to measure. When proximity to you equals opportunity, sincerity is harder to verify. The tragedy of extraordinary power is often isolation at the summit. The higher the platform, the thinner the air. At 72, aging introduces a new dimension. Society rarely treats aging women in media with neutrality. Relevance becomes a negotiation. Visibility becomes curated. The narrative subtly shifts from expansion to legacy. Many of her contemporaries have retreated into privacy. Others have passed. She remains visible, but the spotlight feels different when longevity becomes part of the headline. Aging in public is not simply about appearance. It is about identity recalibration. Who are you when you're no longer building, but preserving? Oprah chose not to marry and not to have children. She has spoken about that decision with clarity. Yet sociological studies suggest that later life reflection often intensifies around themes of continuity and inheritance. Her legacy is vast: schools, networks, philanthropy, cultural influence. But institutional legacy and personal lineage are not identical experiences. At 72, reflection inevitably deepens. Not regret necessarily, but evaluation. And then there is symbolism. Oprah is not merely a person. She is shorthand for transformation. She represents possibility. But symbols are rarely granted the luxury of fragility. The public accepts struggle only if it resolves in a triumph. Exhaustion is less marketable. Lingering grief is less cinematic. Existential uncertainty does not trend. The tragedy, perhaps, is not a scandal waiting to explode. It is cumulative emotional weight. The weight of expectation. The weight of influence. The weight of being everyone's example of resilience while quietly navigating the lifelong imprint of trauma. At 72, the empire stands intact. The brand remains powerful. The influence is undiminished. But behind the empire is a woman who has spent decades turning pain into purpose. And purpose, sustained long enough, becomes responsibility. At 72, Oprah Winfrey exists in a space very few human beings ever occupy. She is not merely famous. She is institutional. Not simply wealthy. She is economically sovereign. Not just admired. She is psychologically embedded in generations of viewers who built parts of their emotional vocabulary through her platform. But the larger the public myth, the heavier the private gravity. And gravity, unlike applause, never disappears. For decades, she mastered narrative control. She understood television not just as entertainment, but as emotional architecture. Every episode of The Oprah Winfrey Show followed a psychological arc: revelation, breakdown, validation, reconstruction. She became fluent in human vulnerability. She normalized therapy language before it was mainstream. She transformed trauma disclosure into collective ritual. Yet one rarely asked question lingers. What happens when the listener absorbs more grief than any single nervous system was designed to process? Psychiatrists speak of compassion fatigue, a depletion state experienced by caregivers and therapists exposed to sustained trauma narratives. It is cumulative. It is quiet. It often goes unnoticed until emotional numbness or exhaustion sets in. For Oprah, this was not an 8-hour clinical shift. It was a quarter-century broadcast into millions of homes. Survivors of incest, families shattered by violence, mothers who buried children, addicts clawing toward sobriety. She sat inches away from their pain, week after week, year after year, while cameras zoomed in on her empathy. The world saw strength. What it did not see was accumulation. Then there is the paradox of invulnerability branding. Oprah's identity became synonymous with resilience. She overcame poverty. She transcended abuse. She built an empire. The arc was clean, inspiring, cinematic. But real trauma recovery is rarely linear. Early developmental adversity alters attachment patterns, stress thresholds, and hypervigilance responses. Success can coexist with triggers. Achievement can coexist with emotional flashbacks. The public narrative celebrated transcendence. The private reality may have required lifelong regulation. Her business empire, Harpo Productions, own network, publishing partnerships, philanthropic foundations, expanded her reach, but also multiplied responsibility. Leadership at that scale is isolating. Billionaire status changes relational dynamics. When one recommendation can move markets, when one endorsement can generate millions in revenue, proximity becomes transactional. The higher the influence, the fewer the truly neutral relationships. At 72, the circle inevitably narrows. There's also aging under a microscope. Society treats aging women differently than aging men, particularly those whose power was once intertwined with charisma and visibility. Oprah remains articulate, commanding, sharp, but cultural framing shifts subtly. Conversations lean toward legacy. Mortality enters subtext. Media profiles begin asking, what will she be remembered for, rather than, what will she build next? That pivot carries psychological weight. Identity built on forward motion must eventually reconcile with reflection. Oprah has spoken openly about choosing not to marry or have children. It was intentional, strategic, self-aware. Yet later life invites contemplation even for the resolute. Institutional legacy, schools in South Africa, scholarships, literacy campaigns, is immense. But institutions are different from intimate lineage. Influence is different from inheritance. At 72, reflection deepens not because of regret necessarily, but because time sharpens evaluation. Another layer rarely discussed is symbolic burden. Oprah became shorthand for empowerment, for the American dream, for female authority in media. Symbols do not get ordinary breakdowns. When public figures cry, it must be purposeful. When they reveal pain, it must teach something. Spontaneous fragility disrupts the myth. Over time, sustaining myth requires discipline. Discipline requires energy. Energy diminishes with age. Financial power does not immunize against existential questioning. In fact, extreme wealth can intensify it. When survival is no longer at stake, meaning becomes central. What remains when expansion plateaus? When every material milestone has been achieved. Philosophers describe this as the post-achievement vacuum, the space where external success no longer provides forward propulsion. For someone who built her life on forward propulsion, that vacuum can feel unfamiliar. Oprah's public life has always been about illumination, bringing hidden stories to light. But illumination is a double-edged instrument. The more light you hold for others, the harder it becomes to retreat into shadow for yourself. Privacy contracts. Solitude becomes strategic rather than organic. The tragedy may not be a dramatic fall or scandal. It may be the quiet realization that the role of emotional anchor for millions leaves little room for being unanchored. And yet she continues. She speaks at events. She curates conversations. She mentors. She invests. Longevity itself is an act of will. But at 72, endurance becomes visible. The voice is steady but measured. The energy is deliberate rather than explosive. The myth remains powerful, but myths age too. Perhaps the heartbreak is not about loss of empire or collapse of relevance. It is about scale, the scale of expectation she carries, the scale of emotional intake she has endured, the scale of solitude that accompanies extraordinary influence. To be everyone's example of triumph can mean rarely admitting fatigue. The world sees the billionaire, the icon, the cultural architect. But behind the empire stands a woman who has spent a lifetime metabolizing pain, first her own, then everyone else's, and converting it into purpose. And purpose, when sustained for half a century, becomes not just identity. But wait, as Oprah Winfrey moves deeper into her 70s, the external narrative remains polished: strategic interviews, carefully curated appearances, philanthropic updates. But longevity at that altitude introduces a quieter, more complex layer: sustainability. Not financial sustainability. Emotional sustainability. Identity sustainability. The question shifts from how did she build it to how does she continue to carry it? Inside her inner circle, dynamics inevitably evolve. Long-term partnership with Stedman Graham has endured for decades without conventional marriage. That alone challenged social norms when their relationship became public. Their arrangement represented autonomy and modernity, but longevity in unconventional structures requires intentional negotiation. Public scrutiny never fully dissolves. Every absence from an event sparks speculation. Every shift in tone fuels headlines. Maintaining relational stability while the world constantly projects narratives onto you is not effortless. It requires discipline, boundaries, and emotional stamina. Then there is the operational weight of an empire. Own Network did not launch as an effortless extension of her brand. It struggled early. Ratings pressure-mounted. Analysts questioned viability. For someone accustomed to near-flawless success, public business turbulence is not just financial, it is reputational. Over time, the network stabilized. But the memory of early instability lingers in leadership psychology. High achievers often internalize downturns more intensely than observers realize. They experience them as identity threats, not merely market fluctuations. At 72, energy allocation becomes strategic. Every public appearance must justify its cost: physical, emotional, cognitive. Travel is no longer trivial. Recovery takes longer. The body introduces its own negotiation. Oprah has spoken candidly about health struggles over the years: weight fluctuations, thyroid issues, knee surgeries. Publicly discussing them reinforced her brand of transparency. Privately managing them requires resilience. The body, unlike business, cannot be restructured through strategy alone. Aging imposes biological boundaries even on titans. Another subtle dimension is relevance recalibration. The media ecosystem that Oprah once dominated has fragmented. Social platforms have decentralized influence. Younger audiences consume content differently. Authority is now algorithmic. While her brand remains powerful, cultural centrality has diffused. For someone who once commanded synchronous national attention at Bond PM Daily, diffusion can feel like displacement, even if it is natural evolution. Legacy figures must redefine influence in an era no longer structured around singular gatekeepers. And then there's grief. Not always public, not always headline-driven. Over 7 decades, loss accumulates. Mentors pass. Friends age. Cultural peers disappear. The passing of time becomes personal, not abstract. Public figures often maintain composure in tribute speeches, but private mourning is different. Reflection deepens. Mortality ceases to be theoretical. Oprah's philanthropic work, particularly in education, carries emotional intensity. The Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa represents more than charity. It represents legacy projection. When you invest in young lives at scale, their successes and struggles become emotionally tethered to your own narrative. Responsibility does not end after donation. It evolves into guardianship. Guardianship at scale is profound but heavy. Financial magnitude also introduces complexity in succession planning. What happens to Harpo? To equity structures? To foundations? To intellectual property? Billionaire estates are not simple inheritances. They are ecosystems. Structuring continuity requires confronting impermanence. Lawyers, advisors, boards, these conversations are pragmatic but psychologically charged. They are acknowledgments that time is finite. There is also a quieter existential recalibration. For decades, Oprah's days were externally structured. Production schedules, editorial meetings, audience tapings. Post-talk show life requires self-authored rhythm. Self-authored rhythm sounds liberating. It can also feel unmoored. When your identity was reinforced daily through audience feedback and measurable cultural impact, silence can feel unfamiliar. High-performance personalities often struggle more with stillness than with chaos. Publicly, she continues to champion growth, gratitude, and intention. Privately, the maintenance of optimism requires work. Optimism, at her level, is not naivete. It is a discipline. To remain symbolically hopeful in a polarized media climate amid global instability demands cognitive effort. Audiences still look to her for emotional framing during crisis. Being the steady voice during turbulent cultural moments is an invisible burden. Perhaps the deepest layer of heartbreak is not dramatic collapse, but quiet endurance. The realization that strength must be continuously regenerated. That influence requires maintenance. That vulnerability, once commodified, must be carefully rationed to remain authentic. The world sees continuity. It does not see calibration. At 72, Oprah Winfrey remains formidable. The empire stands. The philanthropy expands. The brand persists. But behind the brand is a woman navigating aging, responsibility, relational dynamics, health management, legacy architecture, and existential recalibration simultaneously. The myth of invincibility was never hers to claim. It was projected onto her, and projections sustained long enough become expectations. The real tragedy may not be that something collapsed. It may be that nothing has, despite the invisible cost of holding it all together. There's a psychological cost to being perceived as a compass. For more than 4 decades, Oprah Winfrey has not simply participated in cultural conversations. She has directed their emotional tone. When the nation grieved, she contextualized grief. When scandals erupted, she reframed them through accountability and healing. When authors sought legitimacy, her endorsement became literary canon. Her presence signaled seriousness, depth, moral framing. But being a compass means rarely admitting you are lost. America did not just watch Oprah. It outsourced emotional processing to her. Millions learned how to articulate trauma by watching her interviews. They learned the language of boundaries, forgiveness, intention, self-worth. In many ways, She democratized therapy culture before therapy culture was normalized. Yet the burden of modeling emotional regulation at scale is immense. To remain calm while interviewing volatile guests. To remain empathetic while hearing stories of cruelty. To remain composed while mediating public reconciliation. Emotional neutrality, sustained for decades, becomes labor. Emotional labor, when prolonged, reshapes identity. When your reflex is to listen, to validate, to guide, where do you deposit your own unfiltered thoughts? Public figures rarely enjoy messy, emotional expression without consequence. Anger becomes headline. Sadness becomes speculation. Fatigue becomes narrative. So composure becomes default. At 72, composure requires energy. Another layer rarely examined is the burden of moral authority. Oprah's brand evolved into something close to ethical certification. If she platformed a voice, that voice gained legitimacy. If she endorsed a belief, that belief gained traction. With that level of influence comes heightened self-surveillance. Every decision must be filtered through potential cultural impact. Every partnership assessed for reputational resonance. The cognitive load of that constant calibration is invisible but substantial. Then there's the modern media environment. Faster, harsher, less forgiving. Early in her career, broadcast cycles were slower. Context lasted longer. Today, outrage trends within minutes. Narratives mutate instantly. Legacy figures are re-evaluated through contemporary lenses. Past interviews are reinterpreted. Old statements resurface. Longevity in this environment demands vigilance. The cost of a misstep is amplified. For someone who built her life around intentional messaging, the acceleration of discourse introduces tension. Control diminishes in digital ecosystems. Authority fragments. Audiences diversify into algorithmic silos. Oprah's power remains significant, but it operates differently now. The centralized influence she once held has decentralized. Adaptation requires humility. It also requires letting go of total narrative command. And yet, beneath strategic adaptation lies something quieter: identity evolution. When your professional life defined you for decades, retirement is not simply stepping back. It is deconstructing self-concept. Oprah ended her daily talk show in 2011, but the psychological habit of daily impact does not disappear overnight. When applause becomes occasional rather than routine, the nervous system adjusts. Validation rhythms shift. There is also the paradox of transparency. Oprah built her empire on openness, weight struggles, childhood abuse, relationship decisions. Transparency built trust. But long-term transparency creates exposure fatigue. How much of oneself remains undisclosed? What emotional terrain is preserved for privacy? The public may feel intimate with her story, but intimacy at scale is asymmetrical. Millions feel they know her. She knows none of them individually. That imbalance creates subtle loneliness. Health adds another dimension. Aging bodies require management. Recovery from illness or surgery takes longer. Energy is finite. Public expectations, however, rarely scale down with biology. Audiences expect the same presence, the same clarity, the same stamina. But biological reality introduces constraint. Navigating that discrepancy requires grace and acceptance. And acceptance is perhaps the hardest discipline for high achievers. Oprah's life has been structured around overcoming poverty, overcoming trauma, overcoming gender and racial barriers in media, overcoming industry skepticism. The narrative of overcoming built momentum. But aging does not present obstacles that can be conquered in the same way. It presents transitions, slower mornings, more reflection, fewer guarantees. The tragedy, if it exists, may not be a fall from grace or a catastrophic loss. It may be the internal reckoning that strength has limits, that even icons require rest, that even empires demand succession, that even emotional architects must eventually dismantle parts of their own scaffolding. For half a century, Oprah functioned as a bridge between pain and possibility, confession and catharsis, individual trauma and collective dialogue. Bridges carry weight so others can cross safely. But bridges endure pressure continuously. They do not choose when traffic flows. They simply hold. At 72, she is still holding, still advising, still mentoring, still funding, still guiding. But somewhere beyond the stage lights and strategic interviews is a woman who has spent her life absorbing intensity, personal and collective, and transforming it into language the world could digest. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is this. The world learned how to process its emotions through her. But very few ever stop to ask how she processes hers. For most people, it remains abstract until very late in life. For Oprah Winfrey, legacy has been a strategic consideration for decades. When you build an empire that spans media, publishing, education, philanthropy, and cultural discourse, legacy is not an afterthought. It is infrastructure. Yet there is a difference between constructing legacy and emotionally confronting it. At 72, the conversation subtly changes. The question is no longer simply what she has achieved, but what will endure when she is no longer personally steering it. Institutions can be structured. Foundations can be funded. Intellectual property can be cataloged. But influence tied to personality is harder to transfer. Oprah's empire is deeply interwoven with her voice, her tone, her emotional cadence. Removing her from that equation inevitably alters the ecosystem. That realization carries weight. In leadership psychology, there's a phase known as succession anxiety. It emerges when founders begin planning for continuity beyond themselves. It is not fear of death in a dramatic sense. It is fear of dilution. Will the mission remain intact? Will values be preserved? Will the brand retain integrity without the original architect? For someone who spent decades calibrating tone and intent so precisely, relinquishing control, even gradually, requires humility and trust. There is also the quiet fear that every influential figure eventually faces irrelevance. Not public irrelevance. Her name will remain recognized. But cultural centrality shifts. Generations rise who did not grow up watching her daily at Bon PM. Their emotional vocabulary was shaped by podcasts, social media influencers, streaming personalities. Oprah is respected, even revered, but not necessarily central to their daily media consumption. For a woman who once commanded synchronous national attention, that decentralization is profound. It is not a race accomplishment, but it repositions it. Being foundational is different from being current. At 72, mortality is no longer theoretical. It appears in the passing of contemporaries, in memorial tributes, in anniversaries that mark decades instead of years. Reflection intensifies. What remains unfinished? What remains unsaid? What parts of the story have been told, and which have been curated? Oprah has always emphasized intention, gratitude, conscious living. But intention requires maintenance. Optimism requires energy. And energy, biologically, becomes finite. The discipline of remaining emotionally expansive while aging demands self-awareness and acceptance. Acceptance that there will be limitations. Acceptance that some opportunities are no longer worth the cost. Acceptance that slowing down is not surrender. And yet slowing down can feel unfamiliar for someone whose life was defined by acceleration. There's also the matter of wealth, extreme wealth. When financial security is absolute, existential questions surface more clearly. Meaning replaces survival as the central motivator. What drives you when you no longer need to prove anything? When every tangible metric of success has been achieved. For high achievers, identity often fuses with productivity. Decoupling those can be destabilizing. Another undercurrent is narrative ownership. For decades, Oprah controlled her story. She framed her trauma. She defined her triumph. But aging public figures eventually become subjects of retrospective analysis. Biographies are written, documentaries produced, scholars interpret. The story shifts from self-authored to collectively narrated. That transition can feel like loss of authorship over one's own myth. The tragedy in all of this is subtle. It is not dramatic collapse. It is quiet confrontation. Confrontation with time, with transition, with the realization that strength cannot permanently outrun biology, that influence cannot permanently suspend generational change, that even the most carefully built empire must one day operate without its founder at the helm. But perhaps the most poignant dimension is this. Oprah built her career on helping others transform. She guided millions through reinvention. She championed second acts. Now she navigates her own. Reinventing oneself at 72 is different than reinventing at 40. It requires releasing former versions of self without resentment. It requires redefining purpose without urgency. The world continues to see the billionaire icon, the cultural architect, the philanthropist, the woman who changed daytime television forever. And all of that remains true. But beneath the accolades lies a human truth. The later chapters of life demand a different kind of courage. Not the courage to overcome poverty or break barriers, but the courage to let go, to decentralize, to trust successors, to accept impermanence. The empire stands. The influence persists. The legacy is undeniable. Yet, at 72, the real emotional landscape is not about expansion. It is about transition. And transition, even when graceful, is never painless. There is a moment every icon must eventually confront. Not the fall, not the scandal, not the dramatic collapse the media often anticipates, but something quieter, a moment of reckoning with the stage itself. For Oprah Winfrey, that reckoning began publicly in 2011 when she ended the Oprah Winfrey Show after 25 years. It was not forced. Ratings were still strong. Cultural relevance was intact. She left on her own terms. And yet, anyone who studies high-performance psychology understands that voluntarily stepping away from a peak is one of the most psychologically complex decisions a person can make, because the stage becomes identity. For decades, that Chicago studio was not just a workplace. It was rhythm, ritual, reinforcement. Every day, applause confirmed impact. Every interview validated purpose. Every audience reaction created immediate feedback. Remove that daily loop, and something shifts internally. Even if the empire continues, the heartbeat changes. At 72, the reckoning deepens. The question is no longer whether she can step away. She already proved she can. The question becomes whether she is ready to permanently decentralize herself from the narrative she built, to allow the next generation to reinterpret empowerment without her voice guiding it, to let the culture move forward without seeking her framing first. For someone who shaped emotional discourse for half a century, silence can feel louder than applause. There is also the unspoken truth about icons. They rarely receive permission to age publicly in vulnerability. The world tolerates wrinkles. It tolerates slower pacing, but it struggles with diminished presence. We expect our legends to remain steady, wise, composed, until the very end. That expectation alone is a burden, because it denies them the full humanity of uncertainty. Oprah has often said she listens to her inner voice. But what happens when that voice begins to whisper about rest instead of expansion, about legacy instead of launch, about stillness instead of scale? For someone conditioned to build, to produce, to catalyze, stillness can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. And yet the body insists. Time insists. Friends pass. Contemporaries fade. Headlines shift to younger faces. The cultural spotlight rotates. Even if her influence remains respected, it is no longer the singular gravitational force it once was. That is not failure. It is generational evolution. But emotionally, evolution can feel like displacement. There is also the matter of unfinished emotional terrain. When you spend decades helping others unpack trauma, you risk deferring your own deeper layers. Public processing is not identical to private integration. The Oprah the world knows is articulate about her past, but integration is lifelong. Healing is iterative. Aging can reopen old narratives with new perspective. And perhaps the most heartbreaking dimension is this. For so long, she was the one asking the final question, the one guiding the closure, the one offering the lesson at the end of the segment. Now she's in the chapter where closure applies to her. What does goodbye look like for someone who never simply hosted a show, but hosted the emotional climate of a nation? It likely does not arrive in a single dramatic farewell. It arrives gradually. Fewer appearances, more delegation, more reflection, more investment in mentoring rather than leading. It arrives in strategic succession planning, in conversations about intellectual property rights, in estate structuring, in quiet evenings that once would have been filled with production meetings. The world may never witness the private reckoning. It will see the composed speeches, the gratitude, the celebration of impact. But behind that composure may exist a deeply human realization that no matter how vast the empire, no matter how transformative the influence, no one outruns time. And time does not negotiate. The tragedy of Oprah Winfrey at 72 is not collapse. It is not scandal. It is not public disgrace. It is the slow, dignified, complex emotional labor of preparing to let go of the role she mastered better than anyone in modern media history. To move from being the voice that framed the culture to being the legacy the culture reflects upon. That transition requires a different kind of strength than overcoming poverty or building a billion-dollar enterprise. It requires surrender, trust, acceptance. And for someone who carried the emotional weight of millions for decades, surrender may be the hardest lesson of all. In the final chapter of this story, the question is no longer what Oprah Winfrey built. The world knows that answer. The empire is documented, the wealth quantified, the cultural impact archived in libraries, dissertations, and streaming platforms. The real question at 72 is quieter, more intimate, and far more human. Who is she when the lights finally dim for good? For half a century, Oprah existed in motion. Motion toward expansion, toward healing conversations, toward influence, toward growth. Even her departures were strategic evolutions, not disappearances. When she entered her talk show, she did not vanish, she pivoted. When a network struggled, she recalibrated. When culture shifted, she adapted. Movement has always been her language. But aging introduces stillness whether we request it or not. Stillness strips away applause. It removes daily affirmation. It eliminates the reflex of stepping into a studio and commanding a room. In stillness, identity faces itself without audience feedback. For someone who shaped the emotional rhythm of millions, that silence can be disorienting. The tragedy is not that she lacks achievement. It is that achievement cannot accompany her into the most private hours. In the end, empire does not sit beside you in the quiet. Influence does not fill a silent room. Headlines do not soften the awareness of time passing. At 72, there is a confrontation every human must eventually face, the realization that even the most extraordinary life is finite. For Oprah, finitude carries additional layers. She is not simply a private citizen aging quietly. She is a cultural landmark. Her eventual absence will not be subtle. It will generate retrospectives, tributes, replays, essays analyzing her influence. The world will narrate her life again and again. But she will not be there to frame the final narrative. For someone who mastered narrative framing, that reality is profound. There's also the emotional weight of knowing that millions attach pieces of their personal growth to her. People left abusive relationships after watching her segments. Others confronted trauma. Some pursued education. Some forgave. Some changed careers. Her voice became intertwined with turning points in strangers' lives. That kind of embedded influence is beautiful, but heavy, because it means part of her identity lives in people she will never meet. And eventually, those people will move forward without her direct presence. Perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is not that she will step away from the stage, is that she may never experience life fully outside of its shadow. Even in private spaces, she remains Oprah, the brand, the symbol, the reference point, the woman whose name alone evokes transformation. Very few human beings ever get to simply become ordinary again after reaching that altitude. Ordinariness is a luxury icons rarely reclaim. Yet beneath the symbol, beneath the billionaire, beneath the architect of emotional television, there is still a woman who once sat as a child feeling invisible, a teenager carrying shame, a young broadcaster fighting for legitimacy. That girl and that woman coexist. And at 72, reflection likely weaves them together. What did it all mean? Was the cost proportional to the impact? Did the responsibility ever feel too heavy? These are not questions the audience asks. They're questions that surface in private moments. And here is where the story shifts from tragedy to something more complex. Because heartbreak is not only about loss. Sometimes it is about magnitude. The magnitude of a life lived at maximum scale. The magnitude of pressure sustained for decades. The magnitude of expectation carried without collapse. Oprah did not implode. She did not self-destruct publicly. She did not disappear into scandal. She endured. She adapted. She sustained. But endurance is not weightless. The final emotional reckoning is not about whether she succeeded. It is about whether she ever allowed herself to simply rest without purpose attached, to exist without guiding, to speak without teaching, to feel without translating the feeling into a lesson. The world may never know that answer. What we do know is this. At 72, Oprah Winfrey stands as proof that triumph and tenderness can coexist, that strength does not eliminate vulnerability, that influence does not cancel humanity. The tragedy is not a broken empire. It is the quiet truth that even the most powerful emotional compass must eventually set itself down. And when that day comes, when the stage grows dark and the audience disperses, what remains will not be the ratings or the revenue. It will be the human being who carried it all. And perhaps, finally, she will be free to carry only herself.